It is the year 214 BC, and 60 Roman warships are advancing on the harbour of Syracuse in the full light of day. Their decks are crowded with rowers, sailors, marines and missile troops, all under the command of Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the commander later remembered as the Sword of Rome, who has planned a simultaneous sea and land assault designed to break the city quickly, in one overwhelming stroke. He has every reason to be confident. He has built his reputation on breaking enemies before they can adapt. What Marcellus does not know is that a 75-year-old mathematician named Archimedes has spent years engineering the walls of Syracuse into one of the most lethal defensive systems the ancient world had ever seen. Before the siege is done, an iron claw will erupt from the walls, bite into the hull of a Roman quinquereme, and lift its prow violently out of the sea before letting it drop. This is the Siege of Syracuse, and nothing about it will go the way Rome expected. If you are new to this channel, hit subscribe right now, because Wars in History is exactly what the name promises: the real, unfiltered, historically verified truth of how wars were fought, won and lost, built from primary sources and genuine research every single time. Hit the like button if you're already locked in, because it genuinely helps this story reach the people who deserve to hear it. The world Archimedes lived in was being torn apart at the seams, and the fault line ran directly through the Mediterranean. In 218 BC, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca made one of the most audacious decisions in military history. He marched an army over the Alps and drove it straight into the Italian peninsula, inflicting catastrophe after catastrophe on Rome's finest legions. 15,000 soldiers were killed in a single afternoon at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC. Then came Cannae in 216 BC, where between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died in one engagement, the single worst military disaster in the history of the Republic. Rome was not merely losing battles, it was hemorrhaging the experienced officers and soldiers on which its entire military system depended, and the Senate understood with cold clarity that one more major strategic loss could end the war on Carthage's terms. The answer to stabilizing the conflict ran directly through Sicily, Rome's breadbasket, its naval platform, and the geographic bridge between Italy and North Africa. The most important city on that island was Syracuse, a magnificent Greek metropolis with a double harbour, miles of fortified walls spanning the Epipoli Plateau, and a population in the hundreds of thousands. For more than 50 years, the brilliant King Hiero II had kept the city prosperous and safe through careful diplomatic neutrality, maintaining his Roman alliance while investing heavily in Syracuse's physical defences. For the most technically demanding of those engineering projects, he turned to his near kinsman Archimedes, a man who may have studied in Alexandria and certainly corresponded extensively with its leading scholars, at the great intellectual centre of Alexandria, and who returned to Syracuse as the most mathematically gifted person alive, whose work on curved surfaces, mechanics, and the principles of the lever would not be equalled for nearly 2,000 years. When Hiero II died and his inexperienced grandson Hieronymus steered the city toward a Carthaginian alliance, Rome's response was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was dispatched with 60 quinqueremes and a massive land force to bring Syracuse back under Roman control, by force if necessary, and Marcellus fully intended it to be necessary. But Archimedes had already spent years walking those walls, measuring every angle of the harbour, and thinking about exactly this scenario with the same ferocious, totalizing precision he brought to pure mathematics. Rome was sailing into a trap that had been carefully constructed years before the war that brought it there had even begun. The Roman Republic of 214 BC was not the empire that would one day stretch from Scotland to Mesopotamia, but it was already something the ancient world had never quite seen before. A militarized state of extraordinary organizational discipline, capable of absorbing devastating losses and returning to the field stronger than before. Rome had been building its power systematically for centuries, first consolidating the Italian peninsula through a combination of military conquest and political integration, then projecting that power outward across the Mediterranean in a series of increasingly ambitious conflicts. It had already fought and won the First Punic War against Carthage, seizing Sicily and Sardinia and establishing itself as a naval power in the process. By the time the Second Punic War began in 218 BC, Rome commanded the loyalty, willing or otherwise, of most of the Italian peninsula, fielded armies of extraordinary size and professionalism, and possessed the political infrastructure to sustain wars of attrition that would have broken any other state in the ancient world. This was the machine that was now turning its attention to Syracuse. The crisis that brought Rome to Syracuse's harbour had its roots in a simple and brutal political reality. The death of King Hero II left a power vacuum that the city's institutions were not strong enough to fill. Hero had ruled for more than 50 years with a combination of genuine political talent and iron personal authority, keeping Syracuse prosperous, neutral, and carefully positioned between the competing powers of Rome and Carthage. When he died, the throne passed to his teenage grandson Hieronymus, a young man with none of his grandfather's patience, none of his diplomatic instincts, and all of the overconfidence that comes with inheriting power rather than earning it. Hieronymus was almost immediately drawn toward a Carthaginian alignment, seduced by Hannibal's stunning victories in Italy, and by Carthaginian envoys who promised him generous territorial rewards if Syracuse would open its harbours to their fleet. Within a year of taking power, Hieronymus was assassinated, but the damage was irreversible. The factions that took control after his death were deeply divided, the Roman alliance was effectively broken, and by 214 BC, Syracuse had formally committed itself to the Carthaginian side of the war. It was a decision made by frightened, ambitious men operating in a moment of genuine uncertainty, and it was catastrophically wrong. The Roman Senate's response was swift, deliberate, and characteristically disproportionate. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was assigned the Sicilian command with a mandate to bring Syracuse back under Roman control and to make an example sufficiently severe that no other Sicilian city would consider a similar realignment. Marcellus was at this point arguably the most accomplished active commander in the Roman military. He had earned the Spolia Opima, the supreme Roman military honour awarded only to a commander who personally killed an opposing leader in single combat, by slaying the Gallic chieftain Viridomarus in battle in 222 BC. In the entire history of the Roman Republic, only 2 other men had ever claimed this honour. He had served as consul multiple times and had led Roman forces in some of the most demanding campaigns of the generation. Plutarch, who wrote the most detailed surviving biography of Marcellus, describes him as a man of tremendous physical courage combined with a genuine strategic mind. Not simply a fighter, but a commander who thought carefully about how wars were won and lost. The historian Posidonius, cited by Plutarch, described Fabius Maximus as the shield of Rome, and Marcellus as the sword, and the contrast was apt. He was precisely the kind of general Rome deployed when it needed a problem solved decisively and permanently. Marcellus assembled a force that reflected both the seriousness of the assignment and the full weight of Roman military resources. His fleet consisted of 60 kinkaremes, the dominant heavy warship of the age, whose exact rowing arrangement remains a matter of scholarly debate, but whose total complement of rowers, sailors, marines, and weapons operators could reach several hundred men per vessel. These were not transport vessels or light patrol ships. They were floating weapons platforms, capable of ramming, boarding, and delivering concentrated firepower across a harbour. 8 of those 60 kinkaremes were specially modified for the assault on Syracuse's sea walls, paired together in 4 units of 2 ships each, with the inward-facing oars removed to allow the hulls to sit close alongside each other and form stable, wide platforms. On these paired platforms, Roman engineers had mounted sambuci, enormous mechanical siege ladders named after a stringed instrument whose shape they were said to resemble. The sambuca could be winched upright and swung against a city wall, creating a ramp over which soldiers could pour directly from ship to battlement, bypassing the need to breach the walls at ground level. Marcellus was convinced that these devices, delivered quickly enough and in sufficient numbers, would allow him to seize sections of the seawall before the defenders could organise an effective response. The land component of Marcellus's force was no less imposing. His co-commander, the general Appius Claudius Pulcher, commanded a substantial army on the landward side of the city. Ancient sources indicate a force large enough to press the walls simultaneously from multiple directions, preventing the defenders from concentrating their strength at any single point. The strategic logic of the combined assault was straightforward and had worked for Roman commanders in previous sieges: overwhelm the perimeter at so many points simultaneously that the defenders are stretched to the breaking point, force them to make impossible choices about where to concentrate their limited manpower, and exploit any gap that opens, Against a city with normal defences and a normal garrison operating under the normal constraints of ancient warfare, this approach was nearly unstoppable. Marcellus had clearly calculated that Syracuse, for all its size and prestige, would respond the way cities responded, with a finite number of soldiers stretched too thin across too much wall, collapsing under the weight of coordinated professional violence. What he had not calculated, what no pre-battle intelligence could have adequately conveyed, was the precise nature of what Archimedes had built into the walls over the preceding years. The fortifications of Syracuse were not simply stone barriers of the conventional type. Every section of the seawall had been studied and modified to serve as an active weapons platform. Loopholes cut through the stone at various heights allowed archers and operators of small catapults to strike ships at close range while remaining protected behind the wall. The walls themselves were thick enough and stable enough to carry heavy artillery, large torsion-powered catapults and ballistae, mounted directly on the battlements. The whole harbour approach had effectively been prepared for layered fire at different distances, with machines of varying size and power, positioned to cover each phase of an enemy's advance. Archimedes had not waited for the Romans to arrive and then improvised a response. He had anticipated them years earlier, and built a trap so thoroughly engineered that it worked exactly as designed the moment they sailed into range. When the assault finally came, the Romans moved with the disciplined confidence of a force that had broken cities before, and expected to break this one. Marcellus's fleet advanced across the great harbour toward the sea walls in the coordinated formation his plan required, while Appius Claudius Pulcher pressed the land walls from the western and northern approaches. The Sambuca ships moved toward the wall, their great mechanical ladders ready to be raised. The quinqueremes deployed in support formations, their marines preparing to board, and their artillery crews ready to suppress the defenders on the battlements. From the water, looking up at the walls of Syracuse, the Romans would have seen stone, thick, ancient, well-maintained stone, with the dark shapes of defenders moving along the battlements above. They would have recognized the outline of a fortified city preparing to resist a siege. What they would not yet have recognized, not until the first volley was already in the air, was that the wall looking back at them was not passive. It was a machine, and it was already calculating their distance. Archimedes of Syracuse was born around 287 BC, and by the time the Roman fleet appeared in the great harbour, he was approximately 75 years old, an age at which most men of the ancient world, if they survived that long at all, had long since withdrawn from any active role in public life. But Archimedes was not most men, and the mind that had spent decades reshaping the boundaries of human mathematical knowledge had not slowed. If anything, the urgency of the crisis focused him in ways that pure abstract research could not. Ancient sources are consistent in describing him as a man of extraordinary, almost pathological intellectual absorption. Plutarch tells us that servants had to physically drag him away from his work to eat and bathe, that he drew geometric figures compulsively in whatever medium was available, scratching diagrams into the ash of a hearth, or tracing shapes in the oil that collected on his own skin after bathing. He was not eccentric in the performative way of a man seeking attention. He was genuinely elsewhere, present in his body but living almost entirely inside a mental world of quantities, relationships, and proofs that most people around him could not begin to access. His intellectual biography was extraordinary, even by the standards of the ancient world's greatest thinkers. After his early education in Syracuse, Archimedes may have travelled to Alexandria in Egypt to study. The ancient evidence for this is suggestive but not conclusive, though he certainly corresponded closely with the scholars there. At the Great Library and Museum of Alexandria, the institution developed under Ptolemy I and expanded under Ptolemy II, which by Archimedes' time had become the closest thing the ancient world produced to a modern research university. There he worked alongside mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers, whose collective knowledge represented the accumulated scientific achievement of centuries of Greek intellectual culture. He absorbed it, extended it, and in several critical areas simply surpassed everything that had come before him. He developed rigorous methods for calculating the areas of curved surfaces and the volumes of three-dimensional solids that required him to work with concepts of infinite series and limits, ideas that would not be formally systematized until Newton and Leibniz invented calculus nearly 2,000 years later. He established a precise range of values for the mathematical constant pi. He proved the relationship between the volume of a sphere and the volume of its circumscribing cylinder, a result he reportedly considered his single greatest achievement and requested be commemorated on his tomb. He laid the theoretical foundations of hydrostatics, the science of fluids at rest, through rigorous geometric proof rather than mere observation. He articulated the law of the lever in precise mathematical terms, famously declaring that given a lever long enough and a fulcrum to place it on, he could move the world. That last claim, about the lever, was not mere philosophical bravado. It reflected a genuine and profound understanding of mechanical advantage that Archimedes had not only theorized but demonstrated practically. The ancient sources record that he astonished King Hero II by using a system of compound pulleys to single-handedly haul a fully laden ship along the ground, a vessel that would normally have required the coordinated effort of many men and teams of oxen. Plutarch describes Hero watching in amazed silence as Archimedes, seated at a distance, drew on a rope and the ship moved smoothly across the ground as if gliding on water. It was this demonstration, according to Plutarch, that fully convinced Hero of what he already suspected, that Archimedes' understanding of mechanical systems was so deep and so practically applicable that it represented a genuinely strategic asset for the city of Syracuse. From that point forward, Hero reportedly told Archimedes that his genius should be applied to whatever problem Syracuse needed solving, and the fortification of the city became one of the most important of those problems. Archimedes approached the challenge of defending Syracuse the way he approached every other problem, by first understanding it completely in the abstract before applying that understanding to the physical world. He studied the existing fortifications in detail, identifying their structural strengths and weaknesses and mapping the approaches that an attacking force would most logically use. He thought carefully about the geometry of naval assault, the angles at which ships would approach, the distances at which different weapons could effectively be brought to bear, the structural vulnerabilities of the quinquereme hull under various types of impact and stress. He considered the problem of defending a wall that was too long to man entirely with soldiers against an enemy that could choose its point of attack freely, and he solved it the way a mathematician solves any problem of optimization, by designing weapon systems that could cover multiple approach vectors simultaneously and maintain lethality across the entire range of distances from which an attacker might operate. The result was not a collection of individual machines, but an integrated defensive architecture, each component designed to hand off to the next as targets moved through the killing field. The centerpiece of this system, and the innovation that ancient sources emphasize most consistently, was the artillery network. Archimedes positioned catapults and ballistae, the two dominant projectile weapon types of the ancient world, along the seawall at carefully calculated intervals and heights. The catapult, in its standard ancient form, was a torsion-powered throwing machine that used twisted bundles of sinew or hair to store and release enormous amounts of energy, hurling heavy projectiles, stones, lead shot, or fire containers at targets within a fixed effective range. The ballista was a more precise weapon, essentially a giant crossbow powered by torsion, capable of firing bolts or stones with significant accuracy at somewhat shorter ranges. Both types were well known in the ancient world by 214 BC and had been used in sieges for over a century. What made Archimedes' artillery system fundamentally different from anything the Romans had faced before was not the weapons themselves, but the way they had been engineered and calibrated, specifically their capacity to adjust range without losing accuracy. Polybius of Megalopolis, the Greek historian who is the most rigorous and reliable ancient source on the siege, makes this point explicitly in his account. He describes how Archimedes had prepared catapults of varying sizes and power, positioned at different points along the wall, so that operators could engage targets at whatever distance those targets happened to be at any given moment. When the Roman fleet was still far out in the harbour, the largest catapults opened fire with massive stones that could smash through a hull or destroy a deck from a distance that no Roman artillery on the ships could match in return. As the ships came closer, mid-range machines took over, maintaining the barrage without interruption. As ships came still closer, close enough that large catapults could no longer depress to the necessary angle, smaller, faster weapons firing more rapidly filled the gap. Soldiers who survived the long-range barrage and tried to shelter behind shields or below deck found that loopholes in the walls allowed Archimedes operators to direct close-range fire from protected positions, negating the cover that standard shield formations were designed to provide. There was no distance at which a Roman ship in the harbour was safe, and there was no speed of approach that allowed it to pass through the killing zone before taking catastrophic damage. The Sambucae, Marcellus's specialised assault towers mounted on pairs of lashed-together quinqueremes, were supposed to solve this problem by reaching the walls quickly and delivering troops directly onto the battlements before the artillery could destroy the assault platforms. Archimedes had anticipated this solution too. The catapults on the upper sections of the seawall could fire at steep downward angles against targets at the base of the wall, exactly where the Sambucae ships would need to position themselves to deploy their ladders. The result, as Polybius describes it, was that the great mechanical ladders were shattered before they could be raised to their operating position, their timber frameworks destroyed by plunging projectiles from directly above. The assault towers, the Roman answer to the wall, were eliminated not by a counter-tactic but by the same defensive calculation that had already stopped the main fleet. Archimedes had not simply built defences against the attack Marcellus planned. He had built defences against every variation of that attack that a competent general might reasonably devise. Marcellus, watching the assault disintegrate from his command quinquereme, is recorded by Plutarch to have responded with what sounds, in retrospect, less like military humour and more like the stunned admission of a man confronting something genuinely outside his experience. He reportedly turned to his officers and joked that Archimedes was using his ships to ladle out the sea itself, a bitter admission of how helpless Roman force suddenly looked against a device it could neither reach nor counter. But beneath the levity was a recognition that would shape the entire remainder of the campaign. Marcellus understood, in that moment, that direct assault was not going to work. So long as Archimedes remained alive and operational behind its walls, every direct assault promised more Roman losses than results. The Roman general who had built his reputation on relentless victories had been checked, not by a larger army, not by a superior fleet, not by any of the conventional military factors that commanders of his experience knew how to overcome. He had been stopped by an old man's geometry, and now he had to think very carefully about what to do next. Archimedes' entire defensive philosophy at Syracuse was built around one core principle: control your perimeter, know exactly what can enter and what cannot, and never leave a gap that an intelligent adversary can exploit. That same principle applies with absolute directness to your digital life in 2026, where your personal data, your browsing activity, and your private communications are under constant systematic surveillance from sources most people never think about. NordVPN encrypts your internet connection end-to-end, shields your activity from ISP monitoring and third-party data trackers, and allows you to browse, research, and stream from anywhere in the world without your digital movements being catalogued and sold. The link is in the description below. Using that link costs you nothing extra and directly supports the research, writing, and production that goes into every episode on this channel. Because what Archimedes did next makes everything we have covered so far look like a warm-up. With the first daylight assault broken apart before the walls, Marcellus faced a decision that tested the full depth of his strategic intelligence. A lesser general might have doubled down, throwing more ships at the problem, increasing the intensity of the bombardment, pushing harder in the belief that Roman discipline and numbers would eventually overwhelm whatever Archimedes had built. Marcellus was not a lesser general. He recognized that the daylight assault had failed not because of insufficient force, but because the entire approach had been anticipated and countered with a precision that more force would not overcome. So he shifted his tactics in a direction that made intuitive sense given everything he knew about siege warfare. If the defenders could see his ships and aim at them in daylight, he would bring his ships in under cover of darkness, close enough to the base of the seawall that the catapults on the battlements above could not depress to the necessary angle to engage them. It was a reasonable tactical adjustment, built on a reasonable premise. The problem was that Archimedes had not only prepared for the daylight assault, he had prepared for the night assault too, and for the specific logic that would drive a competent general to attempt it. The claw of Archimedes, known in ancient Greek as the harpage, meaning snatcher, is described in detail by Polybius, Plutarch, and to a lesser extent Livy, and while the three accounts differ in some specifics, their core description is consistent enough to give a clear picture of how the device worked. The fundamental mechanism was a large crane-like arm constructed from heavy timber, mounted on a pivoting base set behind and above the seawall, designed so that the arm could swing outward over the top of the wall and extend down toward the water below. At the end of this arm, attached by heavy iron chains and ropes running through a system of pulleys, hung a massive iron grappling hook, the claw itself, shaped and sized to bite into the wooden structure of a ship's hull, prow, or rigging. The entire assembly was counterweighted and operated through a system of ropes and mechanical advantage that allowed a relatively small crew to control enormous forces, exactly the kind of system that Archimedes' mastery of lever mechanics and pulley systems had equipped him to design with precision that no other engineer of his time could have matched. When a Roman ship came close enough to the base of the seawall in the darkness, close enough that the crew likely believed they had finally found the safe zone below the artillery's effective angle, the claw would deploy, the arm would swing out over the wall, the grappling hook dropping rapidly toward the water, and the iron claw would catch on the ship's structure. What happened next is described by Polybius in terms that read, even across 2,000 years of translation, as the testimony of someone who spoke to witnesses who had actually seen it. The hook would bite, the counterweight and pulley system would engage, and the bow of the Roman quinquerem, a heavy warship weighing roughly 100 tons when fully manned with a crew of several hundred men, would begin to rise out of the water, not tilt, not list, rise. The entire forward section of the hull would lift clear of the surface, the stern dropping correspondingly, the ship hanging at a steep and impossible angle with its keel exposed to the night air and its crew sliding, falling and screaming across the tilting deck into the black water below. The ship would hang there, suspended in that grotesque position, for what must have felt to its surviving crew like an eternity. Oars would splinter against the water or snap under their own weight. The hull timbers would groan and crack under stresses they had never been designed to withstand. The structural integrity of a quinquereme was engineered for the forces of waves and wind and ramming impact, not for being lifted vertically by its bow while its full weight acted against itself. Men in armour fell from the deck and drowned immediately. Men without armour fell, and some survived long enough to be pulled under by the current, or finished by the chaos that followed. And then, when the mechanical system released, when the arm dropped the ship back toward the water, the impact of that fall completed what the lift had begun. Ships dropped bow first into the sea and capsized on. Impact. The force of the fall driving the bow below the surface while the stern rose and the whole vessel rolled and broke apart. Ships dropped sideways, crashed against the rocks at the base of the wall, the hull punched open by the impact. Some ships, depending on the angle and the condition of their hulls after the stress of the lift, simply broke in half in the air before they even hit the water, the structural failure occurring at the point of maximum stress as the claw held the bow and gravity pulled the stern downward. Plutarch adds additional details that extend the picture of Archimedes' mechanical ingenuity beyond the single claw device. He describes other machines positioned along the seawall that worked by a different but equally devastating principle. Great weighted beams that could be swung out over the wall and dropped directly onto the decks of ships at the base, punching through the hull planking and sending vessels straight to the bottom without the theatrics of the lift and drop. Some accounts describe stones of enormous weight being suspended on cranes and then released to fall directly through the decks of approaching ships, combining the destructive force of the dropped weight with the structural damage of penetration. The overall picture that emerges from the combined ancient testimony is not of a single device, but of a suite of complementary mechanisms, each addressing a slightly different tactical scenario, all of them operating on the same foundational principles of leverage, counterweight, and mechanical advantage that Archimedes had mastered more completely than any other person in the ancient world. The psychological effect of these machines on the Roman forces was, by Plutarch's account, arguably as militarily decisive as their physical destructive capacity. Plutarch writes explicitly that after repeated encounters with the claw and the dropping weight machines, the Roman soldiers became so deeply conditioned by terror that the appearance of any piece of rope or timber extending above the walls of Syracuse was sufficient to trigger a panic response. He records that soldiers would cry out that Archimedes was aiming a new machine at them and would immediately pull back their ships and flee, abandoning whatever tactical position they had taken up without waiting to see whether the object they had seen actually posed a threat. This is a remarkable psychological datum. It describes a trained, experienced, professional military force that has been conditioned into a fear response so powerful that it overrides tactical judgment and unit discipline. These were not raw recruits terrified by their first experience of combat. These were Roman legionaries and naval veterans who had survived campaigns across the Mediterranean, and they were afraid of a piece of wood sticking out of a wall. That is the measure of what Archimedes had accomplished. Not merely physical destruction of Roman ships and soldiers, but the complete psychological dismantling of Roman offensive confidence at Syracuse. Modern engineering analysis has supported the physical plausibility of the claw. In 2005, a documentary reconstruction commissioned full-scale testing of the device based on the ancient descriptions and the known physics of lever mechanics, pulley systems, and the structural properties of ancient timber construction. The engineers involved concluded without ambiguity that a device matching the ancient descriptions was entirely buildable, with materials and techniques available in 3rd century BC Syracuse, and that it was mechanically capable of lifting the bow of a Kinkerem-class vessel clear of the water, the precise action the ancient sources describe. Archimedes' understanding of mechanical advantage, which he had articulated in precise mathematical terms in his theoretical work, gave him the ability to calculate exactly what dimensions and counterweight ratios would be required to achieve a given lifting force. The ancient accounts present his machines as the direct practical extension of a mathematical mind that had spent decades mastering the principles of leverage and mechanical advantage, and the results, if the ancient sources are to be trusted, bore that mastery out completely. And then there was the weapon that history has argued about ever since. The device that ancient sources writing centuries after the siege attributed to Archimedes, and that later ages named the death ray, the burning mirrors, or the solar concentrator. The claim, in its most fully developed form, is that Archimedes constructed an array of large polished bronze mirrors, or directed soldiers holding individual mirrors, and used them to focus the rays of the Sicilian sun onto the sails and hulls of Roman ships in the harbour, generating enough concentrated heat to set them on fire. The story is dramatic. It is geometrically coherent with everything we know about Archimedes' mastery of curved surfaces and reflective optics, and it has been debated by scientists, historians, and engineers for centuries without being definitively settled in either direction. What the historical record actually shows is more complicated and more interesting than a simple yes or no answer, and the channel's commitment to accuracy requires that complexity be addressed honestly. The earliest and most rigorous ancient sources, Polybius and Livy, do not mention burning mirrors at all. This silence is significant, because Polybius in particular was a careful, skeptical historian who explicitly sought out eyewitness accounts and was generally resistant to embellishment. The story of Archimedes burning Roman ships appears only in later sources, and the explicit burning mirror version is later still. Later ancient writers sometimes refer to ships being destroyed by fire during the siege, but the first unequivocal written reference specifically to burning mirrors comes from the mathematician Anthemius of Tralles, writing around AD 500, nearly 7 centuries after the events themselves. In 1973, the Greek scientist Dr. Ioannis Sakas organised approximately 60 sailors, each holding a flat polished mirror, and directed their reflected sunlight onto a wooden boat moored roughly 50 metres away, which ignited. Later experiments have similarly shown that concentrated reflected sunlight can raise temperatures significantly under controlled conditions. But these tests demonstrate a physical principle. They do not prove that Archimedes actually deployed such a weapon at Syracuse. Whether or not Archimedes built burning mirrors at Syracuse, he likely understood the optical principle behind them. His mastery of reflective geometry makes that much plausible. But the surviving evidence does not prove that such a weapon was actually constructed or deployed at Syracuse, and the story's late appearance in the historical record keeps that question permanently open. What the legend does reliably illustrate is the degree to which Archimedes' reputation for boundless mechanical ingenuity had become, by the time the siege was over, a weapon in its own right. Rome faced a defender so far beyond normal engineering experience that even the weapons he might not have built were militarily credible. The terror was not just physical, it was epistemological. The Romans genuinely did not know what Archimedes was capable of, and that uncertainty, that inability to confidently say what was possible and what was not when this particular mind was involved, was itself a form of strategic paralysis that no army, however disciplined, could simply drill its way out of. Rome did not break Syracuse with iron. Rome broke Syracuse not by defeating Archimedes' machines directly, but through a combination of time, total blockade, slow starvation, internal political fracture, and ultimately betrayal from within. A coalition of pressures that no amount of mechanical genius could indefinitely hold back. After the catastrophic failure of both the daylight assault and the night assault, after the Zambuque had been smashed and the fleet had been terrorized into a conditioned panic response by the claw, Marcellus made the strategic pivot that his intelligence and experience demanded. He abandoned the direct assault entirely and converted the siege into a total blockade. His fleet sealed the great harbour and the outer approaches, cutting off all maritime traffic into and out of the city. His land forces under Appius Claudius Pulcher sealed the roads and landward approaches, establishing a continuous encircling perimeter around Syracuse's extensive walls. Nothing would go in. No food, no supplies, no reinforcements, no messages of hope. The people of Syracuse, soldiers and civilians alike, the garrison that had watched Archimedes' machines shatter a Roman fleet, and the ordinary inhabitants who had cheered from behind the walls, would simply be enclosed and left to slowly exhaust everything they had. It was not glorious. It did not make for the kind of dramatic military narrative that Romans painted on temple walls or celebrated in triumphal processions. But it was correct, and Marcellus knew it, and he was patient enough to see it through. The blockade stretched into months and then into years. Carthage, which had promised Syracuse its support and whose strategic interests were directly served by keeping Rome pinned down in a lengthy Sicilian siege, made genuine attempts to break the encirclement. A Carthaginian relief army was landed in Sicily under the command of the general Hamilco, moving to challenge the Roman land forces and relieve pressure on the city. A Carthaginian fleet simultaneously attempted to challenge Roman naval supremacy in Sicilian waters and force open the harbour. Both efforts ultimately failed to achieve their objectives. The Carthaginian land army, operating in the Sicilian interior during the summer months, was devastated by an outbreak of disease. Plague, most likely. Though ancient sources use terms that do not map precisely onto modern diagnostic categories, that killed enormous numbers of soldiers and stripped the force of its offensive capability before it could mount a decisive engagement with Marcellus's legions. The Carthaginian fleet was outmaneuvered and driven off without breaking the Roman naval blockade. Syracuse remained sealed. The relief that the city's leadership had gambled everything on never arrived with the force or the timing that would have mattered. Inside the walls, the arithmetic of the blockade was working its slow and merciless mathematics on the population. A city the size of Syracuse, with its hundreds of thousands of inhabitants and its substantial military garrison, consumed food at a rate that no finite internal stockpile could indefinitely sustain. The early months of the blockade, when supplies were still relatively adequate, and the memory of the machine's triumph over the Roman fleet was still fresh, probably maintained something close to normal morale. But as the blockade extended through its first year and into its second, the signs of deep strain would have become impossible to ignore. Rationing, then severe rationing, then the grinding, humiliating desperation of genuine hunger, the kind that turns professional soldiers into men who can barely lift their weapons and civilians into scarecrows, haunting the streets of a city that was slowly dying from the inside out. Archimedes' machines still stood on the walls. The Romans still could not take the city by force, but the machines could not manufacture grain, and the mathematics of food consumption was as remorseless and as precise as any calculation Archimedes had ever made. By 212 BC, deep into the second year of the blockade, the garrison of Syracuse was a shadow of the force that had humiliated the Roman fleet in the opening assault. Soldiers were weakened. The intensity of the watch on the walls had inevitably degraded as manpower thinned and exhaustion accumulated. The civilian population was in serious distress. The political leadership of the city was fractured between factions that argued for continued resistance, factions that contemplated negotiation, and individuals who were quietly exploring whether their personal survival might be better served by a different set of allegiances. Into this environment of exhaustion, hunger, and fracturing political will came the occasion that Marcellus had been waiting for. Not an opportunity he had manufactured, but one that the rhythms of Greek religious life delivered to him with almost providential timing. The annual festival of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, one of the most sacred and non-negotiable observances in the Greek religious calendar, fell in the late summer or early autumn of 212 BC, while the siege was still in progress. Festivals of this kind were not optional social occasions in the ancient world. They were sacred obligations, woven into the fabric of Greek civic and religious identity at a level that superseded practical military considerations. To fail to observe the festival of Artemis was not merely imprudent, it was an act of impiety that would invite divine punishment, and a population already suffering the catastrophe of a 2-year siege was in no psychological condition to add the fear of divine abandonment to its burdens. So the festival was observed. Ancient sources indicate that wine was distributed. The specific mention of wine in several accounts is significant, because it tells us not merely that the festival was celebrated, but that it was celebrated in the traditional manner, with the ritual consumption that Greek religious observance required. The garrison drank, the watch on the walls thinned. The vigilance that had held for 2 years softened for a single night into something approaching the normal human need to mark a sacred occasion with communal relief. A Roman informant. The ancient sources describe this person variously as a deserter, a traitor from within the city, or a spy who had maintained contact with the Roman camp throughout the siege, brought Marcellus detailed intelligence about the state of the garrison and the walls during the festival. Specifically, the informant identified a section of the outer wall circuit, the Epipolae plateau fortifications, which formed the landward extent of Syracuse's defences, where the watch had been reduced to near nothing by the combination of festival observance and 2 years of accumulated exhaustion. The wall there was not undefended in theory. It was simply, on this particular night, undefended in practice. Marcellus moved with the decisive speed that had defined his entire military career. A selected group of Roman soldiers, the sources suggest a small, carefully chosen assault party rather than a mass formation, the kind of force that moves quietly rather than loudly, approached the Epipolae wall under cover of darkness and the noise of the festival celebration, still audible from within the city. They found the wall exactly as the informant had described it. The watch was minimal, the guards either absent at the festival, asleep at their posts, or in a condition that made them ineffective sentinels. The Romans scaled the wall using ropes and ladders. They established a foothold on the battlements. They signalled back to the main Roman force, and within hours Marcellus controlled the outer city of Syracuse, the section that sat on the Epipolae plateau and that, once in Roman hands, made the final reduction of the inner city and the harbour district a matter of time rather than doubt. The inner city, centred on the fortified island of Ortygia in the harbour, held out somewhat longer through a combination of its natural defensive advantages and the desperate resistance of those who understood that the fall of Syracuse meant the end of everything they had been fighting for. But its fall was now inevitable. Rome's patience had been rewarded with the one thing that Archimedes' machines had never been designed to prevent: a moment of human weakness on a sacred night after 2 years of impossible strain. Marcellus entered the captured portions of the city and, according to Plutarch, stood on the heights of Epipolae and looked down at Syracuse spread below him. Its harbours, its temples, its streets, the vast, beautiful city that had held him at bay through a grinding siege, and wept. It is one of the more remarkable emotional moments recorded in ancient military biography, the more so because it comes from an account of a Roman general standing in a position of absolute victory. Plutarch's explanation for the tears is that Marcellus was moved by the knowledge of what was coming, the looting, the destruction, the degradation of a city whose beauty and cultural significance he genuinely appreciated. He gave orders designed to limit the worst of what Roman soldiers typically did to a conquered city. He instructed his troops to spare the inhabitants and to avoid burning the structures. And he gave one specific personal order that stood apart from the general directives of military administration. Archimedes was to be found and brought to him alive, unharmed and treated with full respect. This was not a casual instruction. It was the order of a man who had spent 2 years being outmaneuvered by a single mind, and who wanted, more than almost anything else the sack of Syracuse could give him, the chance to look at that mind directly. He never got the chance. The circumstances of Archimedes' death are preserved in 3 separate accounts in the ancient sources, from Plutarch, Livy, and the later writer Valerius Maximus, and while they differ in some specific details, they are consistent in their essential structure. A Roman soldier, moving through the city in the chaos and violence of its fall, encountered an old man. By the most famous and most detailed version of the account, and Plutarch himself records multiple variants, the old man was so absorbed in working on a mathematical problem, drawing geometric figures in the sand or dust at his feet, that he had not adequately registered the collapse of everything around him. When the soldier confronted him, Archimedes is said to have asked him not to disturb his diagrams. He wanted to finish the problem before he moved. The soldier, who either did not know who the old man was, did not care, or was simply operating in the savage, undiscriminating logic of a soldier in a city being sacked, killed him. Archimedes of Syracuse died in the dust beside his circles at approximately 75 years of age. The reaction of Marcellus when he learned what had happened is recorded by Plutarch with striking emotional specificity. He was overcome with grief. He turned away from the soldier responsible as if from something polluted, a formulation in Plutarch's Greek that carries strong connotations of ritual impurity, suggesting that Marcellus regarded the killing not simply as a military indiscipline, but as something approaching sacrilege. He sought out the members of Archimedes' surviving family, treated them with honour, and attended personally to the arrangements for burial. And he honoured what was reportedly Archimedes' own pre-expressed wish regarding his tomb, that it be marked not with an inscription glorifying his military contributions or his service to Syracuse, but with a geometric diagram, a sphere inscribed within a cylinder, representing the mathematical relationship that Archimedes himself had considered his greatest discovery. The man who had built the weapons that killed Roman soldiers and terrorized the Roman fleet was commemorated at a Roman general's personal direction with a figure of pure mathematics. Marcellus understood, with the clarity that only genuine respect can produce, that what Archimedes had been was not primarily a weapons engineer or a military asset. He had been, first and last and always, a mathematician. The weapons were an interruption. The geometry was the man. The fall of Syracuse in 212 BC sent immediate and powerful shockwaves through the political geography of Sicily. Other cities that had been wavering in their Carthaginian alignments rapidly reconsidered their positions. The strategic prize that Rome had sought, control of Sicily's most important harbour, and the neutralization of Carthaginian naval influence in the region, was secured. The broader war against Carthage continued for years afterward, but the fall of Syracuse represented a turning point in Rome's Sicilian campaign, and the resources and strategic position it provided contributed meaningfully to Rome's ultimate victory in the Second Punic War. Rome won exactly what it had come for, but the manner of the winning and the 2 extraordinary years it had taken to achieve it were burned permanently into the Roman military's institutional memory. Polybius, writing within a generation of the events and drawing on testimony close to the campaign, treated the siege as a case study in the decisive impact a single technically gifted individual could have on the outcome of a military operation. Plutarch, writing later, framed it as one of the defining episodes in the biography of one of Rome's greatest generals, notable not for the victory but for the man who had made the victory so costly and so difficult. Rome won the Siege of Syracuse, but it won by waiting for a festival, by exploiting a single night of exhausted human carelessness, by starving a population into unsustainable vulnerability over 2 grinding years. It did not win by breaking Archimedes' machines. It did not win by finding a tactical answer to his catapults or a structural weakness in his claw. It won because the city ran out of food, and because one night the wine was flowing and the gods demanded celebration, and the soldiers on the walls were too tired and too hungry to hold their posts with the discipline that nearly 2 years of Archimedes' defensive genius had otherwise sustained. That is the brutal truth at the heart of this story. The greatest military force in the Western world was stopped dead for 2 years by one man's mathematics, and when it finally won, it did so not through superior force or superior intellect, but through the simple, terrible, unglamorous power of time. The walls of Syracuse are mostly gone now. The harbour still exists, quieter, smaller, stripped of the military significance it once carried, and if you visit the southeastern tip of Sicily today, you can stand on the Ortigia island and look out at the water where Roman quinqueremes once approached in the dark and found, to their horror, that the dark was full of machines. The stones Archimedes' catapults hurled are gone. The timber of the claw has long since rotted back into the earth. The polished bronze of whatever mirrors he may or may not have built has dissolved into the centuries. Nothing physical remains of what one man constructed on those walls, but what he understood, the mathematics that powered every one of those machines, the geometry of curved surfaces and the law of the lever, and the precise mechanical relationships he articulated with more rigour than anyone before or after him for nearly 2,000 years, that survived. It survived in manuscripts copied by Byzantine scholars, translated by Arabic mathematicians during the centuries when European learning had temporarily contracted, and rediscovered by European scientists during the Renaissance, who found in Archimedes' methods the intellectual foundations they needed to build the modern scientific tradition. Galileo read him. Newton built on him. The integral calculus that Leibniz and Newton independently developed in the 17th century completed, in a sense, the work Archimedes had begun at Syracuse and in his study 2,000 years earlier. The real legacy of the Siege of Syracuse is not the military outcome. Rome won, as Rome almost always won, by being larger and more patient and more willing to endure cost than any opponent could sustain. The real legacy is the demonstration, permanent, historically documented, impossible to argue away, that a single human mind, fully applied to a problem it understands completely, can alter the course of events on a scale that even the largest armies cannot easily overpower. Archimedes did not save Syracuse forever. He could not stop starvation or prevent a festival, or ensure that the watch on the walls would hold on one particular night in 212 BC. But he held the most powerful military force in the Western world outside those walls for the long siege through nothing but the application of mathematics to physical reality. He made Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the Sword of Rome, a commander famed for relentless victories, sit outside a city through a grinding siege and think very hard about geometry. That is an achievement with no parallel in the history of warfare, and it belongs entirely to one old man drawing circles in the sand. This has been the Siege of Syracuse. This has been the story of Archimedes. Thank you for watching Wars in History. If this story hit you the way it hits us every time we go back through the sources, then please take 10 seconds right now and leave a comment below. We genuinely want to know what you think. Do you believe the death ray was real and that Polybius simply omitted it? Or do you think it was a legend that grew around Archimedes' already extraordinary reputation? Do you think Archimedes knew the city had fallen when that soldier found him and chose the circle anyway? These are not rhetorical questions. The answers people leave in this comment section are consistently among the most thoughtful historical discussions on the platform, and every single one gets read. Hit subscribe if you have not already done so. This channel exists because of the people who watch it and share it, and every subscriber directly enables the depth of research that goes into every episode. Share this video with one person who you think deserves to know this story, because history this extraordinary should not be confined to an algorithm. And a final word on NordVPN. If you want to support this channel while also doing something genuinely useful for your own digital security, the exclusive link in the description gives you a significant discount on NordVPN plus extra months added free. It is the most trusted VPN service in the world. It protects your connection and your data the way Archimedes protected the walls of Syracuse, and using our link costs you nothing extra while going directly toward keeping Wars in History producing content at this level. We will see you in the next battle. Stay curious. Stay ruthless about the truth. Wars in History.